Hi, I'm Sherry Hudson-Passy. Thank you so much for joining me for this session. This is Discovering Slaveholders in the Family Tree, from reaction to action, remembering names and reuniting families. I would love to hear from you. So I posted on this page my contact information, my email, my blog, my Facebook, my Instagram, and Twitter. I hope that after watching this presentation that we can continue a conversation. If you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with me. So here's our agenda for today. First, we're going to talk about who may find these type of records that show that their ancestors owned slaves. And there we're going to talk a few minutes about the reactions, those feelings when we find these records. We'll talk about finding the records. What types of records show that our ancestors owned slaves? And then we're going to talk about the actions that we can take, the positive actions, so that we can go from reaction to action. First, let's talk about who. Who may find these records? Well, you know, when you start talking about the records of the enslaved and slaveholders, many people jump right to the southern United States. But you know, it's not just a southern thing in America. As a matter of fact, you can find the practice of slavery in different time periods all over the world. So these things that we'll talk about today apply everywhere. The Slave Dwelling Project is helping to show that that's not true. Slavery happened in more places than just the southern United States. Joseph McGill of Charleston, South Carolina, began this project a few years ago. His goal was to find and sleep in as many extant former slave dwellings as possible. He has slept in traditional slave cabins, basements, where the servants lived, and prison cells. For those no longer in existence, he'll look for the evidence of a location and then sleep in a tent. Now, he just doesn't sleep alone. He invites others to participate in the experience. Descendants of slave owners and the enslaved have joined together. Imagine the conversations. They are emotional and enlightening. He says they usually end with mutual respect and understanding. Now, here's an example to show you, demonstrated by Joe, that slavery existed all over the United States. Now, besides the southern states that come to mind, he has also slept in Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Wisconsin. Now, many of those states you wouldn't think of as states where you might find documents on your ancestors about the enslaved. Let's talk a little bit now about reactions when we discover these records. It can be a surprise, and sometimes we just don't even know what to do and what to think. Now, many of us are just taken by surprise. We had thought, oh, our family is too poor. I know that my grandmother always used to say, oh, our family never owned slaves. We were too poor. Or, my family would never do that. They were good people. They would never own slaves. Oh, we just don't live in the right location. Nobody had slaves where our ancestors were from. Well, there's no story. I don't remember anybody saying anything about us having slaves. None of that's been passed down in the family. Once we do find these documents, our emotions can run the gamut from shock, absolute shock that we have found them, especially when they come from an area you never in your wildest dreams thought would be a place to find records of your ancestors holding slaves. Sadness is a big one, that this happened and it happened in your family. Regret, you're sorry that it happened, and sometimes you're sorry that you found the records to begin with. Embarrassment can be a big problem. You're embarrassed. You don't want anybody to know. What would they think of you if they knew your family owned slaves? Fear. There's a lot of fear that can be involved. As I said, what would people think of me? Will something happen to me because people discovered that either the place where I live once had slaves on it or my ancestors owned slaves? So fear can be a very big emotion that comes to us when we find these records of the enslaved. And then there's denial. Oh, these records can't be right. It just can't be. Like we said before, my ancestors would never do this, to the point where people want to hide it and keep it off their family trees and not tell anybody. Well, a reality can hit home for all of us as we discover that our ancestors owned slaves. My reality came as I visited a plantation that my paternal ancestors once owned. As I walked through the property, saw the beautiful buildings, but then walked down to the cemetery where the enslaved had been buried, my trip suddenly took on a brand new meaning, and my desire to do something about the names of those people that were enslaved on this property took a turn. Now this is a picture of some of the cabins that once belonged at Springbank Plantation in Williamsburg County, South Carolina. And this photo was given to me by a cousin, William McElveen. The cabins are no longer there, and we're hoping that maybe one day we can have a sleepover here and just camp out on the property with Joseph McGill and talk to the descendants of those that had been enslaved there and the descendants of those who owned the property and were the enslavers. Well, finding the enslaved. You know, the records tell the truth. When we make these discoveries, we learn things and our narrative changes about our families. Slave schedules are usually the first indication that we find that our ancestors owned slaves. We see the ancestor's name, and then we see how many enslaved they had, and we see if they were male or female, and we can see the ages. Or maybe it was a census tick mark. As we go across that census and we see the list of the slaves that were counted as our ancestry's property in their household. Or it could be discovering the occupation of an ancestor was overseer. No, he may not have owned the slaves on the plantation, but his job was to oversee them, keep them in line. You've heard the stories about overseers. There may be records that were produced from the work that he did on a plantation. And then there are wills, bequeathing the enslaved to descendants, friends, and other people. I actually have a will that was written towards the end of the Civil War, and the woman whose will it was states that if the Northern Army brings back her property, meaning the slaves, these are the people she wants them to go to when she dies. She obviously was not understanding what was happening around her. And then there are those inventories that you find in probate packages that list human chattel, names, ages, prices of people. Personal papers will sometimes give us clues that our ancestors were enslavers. Whether they owned a plantation, a business, a farm, whatever they did, they may have purchased slaves to help them run it. This is a bill of sale, selling an enslaved person from one person to the other. Sometimes you can find little day books where they kept journals of the daily runnings of a business, a plantation, a farm, whichever occupation that they had, and the names of the enslaved will appear in those. Many people discover that their ancestors owned slaves when they're looking at court cases. Court cases are where people are contending over property, and since the enslaved were property, any disputation went to court. Also, you can find court records where people are filing for manumission. They want to free their slaves. Sometimes when we're researching in the newspaper and we put our ancestor's name in that little search bar, up pops some things that maybe we don't want to see. In this case, it's a runaway slave ad that lists several of my ancestors. It lists who owned him and what neighborhood they thought him to be running to. Sometimes we find and discover that our ancestors owned slaves through reading about books about them, journals, and letters that mention the slaves that were in their household. Not only have we discovered that we have slave-owning ancestors, we have ancestors that were enslaved. Now let's talk about some actions we can take. First of all, we have got to remember that we are not responsible for our ancestors' actions. We can, however, step up and do something positive with the information that we found. We can share what we find. We can release their names. Now, what do I mean by release their names? Well, for many enslaved person, their names have not been said for generations. They are lost in the records of our ancestors. We can transcribe names that we find, physical descriptions, family units, chains of ownership, and clues to other records that our records may point to. It's so important that you share the information that you're finding. Some ideas are to blog about these records. If you have a blog, just write a post, transcribe all the information from that document, including names, descriptions, location, the slave owner, and publish it. Add a photo as well of the document. Then, if somebody is online searching for enslaved people in that location, information on an enslaver, your blog post will come up, and then you can work together to connect the families. If you run across any original records, donate them. Look for a library, a historical society, a museum, an archive, someplace that takes these type of materials. By doing that, they can add what you've donated to their files, to their finding aids, to their catalog, so other people can find them. Add the information to African American resources. There are many Facebook pages and other places where you can add the information and connect with people. There are many listed in the syllabus. Become part of a project. Think about the slave dwelling project that we talked about. Perhaps you know of some extant slave dwellings and property near you, or property that your ancestor owned. Contact them and see if you can't schedule a sleepover there and get the descendants of the enslaved and enslavers together for a powerful conversation. Crowdsource. Again, Facebook is a wonderful friend for genealogists. Post on the county sites. Post on African American sites the things that you're finding and see if you can make connections. Support any community efforts, either the genealogy community or your local community, in their attempts to discover the names of the enslaved. Here's another way to do something really positive. Research down the line. Pull out those names of the enslaved in your ancestors' records. See if you can go down the generations and make a connection with living people. Now, what about those DNA matches when you find something in there that you are not expecting? You've discovered that you have African American DNA. You can start by looking in your tree for connections and try to find out which line it may have come from. You can look at paper records to see if you can discover who that DNA match is, which generation it is, so you can honor that ancestor. Now, whether you get a query responding to a DNA match or a query asking you for information about an ancestor in your family who owned slaves, don't be afraid. Take a few minutes to understand that they just want to make those connections and find out what you might know. So once you take that moment and step back, get yourself to a place where you can respond to the query. Share what you know. Help them find the most common ancestor, and then welcome a new family member. The most important thing that we need to do is work together. We need to extract the names of the enslaved from our documents. We need to share what we found. We need to reach out. We need to work to connect families. So thank you so much for watching this session. It's very important to me, this presentation. As a daughter of the South, I felt all the emotions that we discussed. I was in disbelief. You wouldn't think I was, since I am a daughter of the South and I am a descendant of slaveholders. And it is my mission to help those of you that are the same to deal with it, to work together with the descendants of the enslaved to help them find their ancestors, to be able to connect families together, and in turn they can help us find information on our families. So I would love to hear from you. Please email me. Please send me a comment about the things that you've been doing. So important to have this conversation. Again, thank you so much, and I hope to hear from you soon. Email me, Sherry@carolinagirlgenealogy.com. Bye, everybody.